Good morning. Welcome to Tin Media. My name is Isaac Jasper. As we conduct this conversation, the American occupational state is escalating its war on the poor, migrant workers, and asylum seekers from countries imperialism exploits by deploying troops to occupying homeless encampments from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., creating a Gestapo-like force with the sole purpose of feeding rampant escalation and community resistance to kidnappings in broad daylight, while funding ICE with a staggering $167 billion, a budget of empire used not for liberation, but for repression and containment of the masses it exploits. This violence is hidden in plain sight by a coordinated propaganda machine. Recent exposés reveal that dark money is funneling 8,000 a month at a tune to so-called independent journalists and creators, voices like David Pakman and Women for America, to distort narratives, deny genocide in Gaza, obscure the crumbling of the US dollar, and to spin crises to suit the Democratic Party's agenda. This isn't journalism. It is a paid performance designed to sanitize oppression to help us unravel this system of imperial power and historical disinformation. We are honored and joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, who holds the Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston and author of over 40 essential books, including his latest, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C. from 1800 to 1865, which you can find on the International Publishers website to secure your own copy. Dr. Horne, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Let's start off with Trump's takeover in D.C., which was a kind of a preemptive to, or not a preemptive, but L.A. was kind of preemptive to this. I'd like to go over the fact that this, you stated in a video, I want to say yesterday or day before yesterday, that the counter-revolution of 1776 is our earliest knowledge of this settler-colonial system's colonial model. Let me rephrase that. It says the counter-revolution of 1776 is, to my knowledge, the earliest recorded within the settler colonial model that we still live in under today. You speak to why. Can you speak to why we know this? We know now in 2025 face this same counter-revolution take fold under the oligarchical cabinet of Donald Trump.
Well, Washington, D.C. is a soft target with regard to creating a laboratory for a neo-fascist experiment with the residents, a plurality of whom were of African ancestry, being the guinea pigs. This stems from the U.S. Constitution, which gives Congress oversight of the budget of the District of Columbia. And so therefore, when Mr. Trump sent National Guard personnel to Los Angeles, he received pushback from the governor, who has presidential aspirations. He received pushback from two U.S. senators, Adam Schiff and Alex Padilla. In contemplating sending personnel to Chicago, Governor Pritzker, who has presidential aspirations, has pushed back, along with the mayor, Brandon Johnson, not to mention senators. But Washington, D.C. is unique in the United States of America. There's no governor. There are no senators. There is one congressional representative, the enfeebled Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who has circumscribed voting rights. And therefore, it was felt that a president that could be established in the District of Columbia could then be expanded nationally. And in any case, the Trump regime has shown that it has disdain for the District of Columbia. Recall that a few weeks ago, when Attorney General Pam Bondi, or Scam Blondie, decided to impanel a grand jury to investigate the so-called Russiagate scandal, that she chose not to impanel the grand jury in the District of Columbia, but in South Florida, because it is felt that jurors in the district who only gave Mr. Trump 6% of the vote in the 2024 election are politically unreliable. And of late, you may recall that there have been grand juries and panel to bring felony indictments against other accused, including a now fired Justice Department employee who threw a Subway sandwich at an officer in the streets of the District of Columbia, and the grand jury refused to indict him. And that's the kind of political unreliability that the U.S. administration cannot tolerate and cannot stand. And so we find now that the District of Columbia is going through this experiment. We should expect that young Black youth, young Black men, will be a primary target. After all, they were accused of triggering Mr. Trump's dispatching of National Guard. They were accused, speaking of young Black men, of assaulting a member of the Department of Government Efficiency in an attempted carjacking, it was said, and that triggered Mr. Trump. So this is a very dangerous and perilous situation that we face. Washington, D.C. is already perhaps the most surveilled city on planet Earth. It has 17 different intelligence agencies headquartered there. Not only the well-known CIA, but the Defense Intelligence, State Department has intelligence, et cetera, either in the district itself or on either side in Maryland and or Virginia. And so now that is not seen as sufficient in terms of surveillance. Now you have National Guard personnel at metro stops, at subway stops. Although interestingly enough, areas that supposedly have a more significant crime rate have been ignored in terms of dispatching these armed officers of the law to Georgetown and other posh districts. So once again, this is a very dangerous experiment with the denizens of the District of Columbia being treated like guinea pigs.
Yeah, and apologies because I butchered my first question that I had for you, and so I'm gonna try and go off the cusp to try and get another question out there, being that's still related to my first question, is that this is not the first time we've seen a act of counter revolution. Could you speak to kind of like this is more essentially a boomerang effect. It mirrors, for those that, want an example, Nazi Germany, but we know that, this was, Hitler learned this from how he treated the indigenous populations at one point, stating, or reading the likes of John Muir, and going on a limb to say that, this was, he idolized John Muir's work to the point where he, would classify one of his works as a Bible, essentially. Could you just speak to the reinventing of this counter-revolution, how we've seen it in 1776, you wrote about that. We've seen it in 1836, you wrote about that. We've seen it in 1893, you wrote about that. This is just a continued model that essentially never gets contradicted or properly addressed. It just kind of rolls along with the empire.
Well, it has been contradicted by myself amongst others. And
let me rephrase
well.
that. Sorry.
Perhaps you can question the success or lack thereof of our contradiction, but it has been challenged. I think that it would not be unfair to suggest that settler colonialism itself is a counter-revolution. That is to say, the process whereby Europeans cross the Atlantic and uproot indigenous polities and with luck and pluck drag Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free, with the indigenous liquidated and or dispersed around the planet. That sounds like a counter-revolution to me. And so we should not be shocked nor surprised by the unfolding of events in the District of Columbia. In fact, We can see it more as an escalation, more so than an innovation. That is to say that it's not as if what's happening in Washington, D.C. is altogether novel or new. We see the roots previously, but given the present moment, given the crisis that U.S. imperialism is facing as a result of the erratic and anti-popular policies of the Trump regime, there is a felt need to crack down domestically because there is a real fear in U.S. ruling circles that the U.S. economy is heading for an iceberg. In the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the elite journal of the Council on Foreign Relations on the posh Upper East Side of Manhattan, there's an article by Harvard's Kenneth Rogoff where he's basically predicting another rendition of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Recall that what happened then was a rise of the left, a rise of radicalism, a rise in terms of trade union organizing. And in order to forestall that possibility occurring as a result of this impending renewed Great Depression, the Trump regime is trying to get ahead of the curve. And we understand that because as we speak in China, we see the glimmerings of a new world order, not like the new world order that was proclaimed a few decades ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but a new world order that this time is going to be taking advantage of the weaknesses of U.S. imperialism. Mr. Trump is partially responsible, not altogether responsible, of course. I say partially responsible because it was Mr. Trump who imposed or has sought to impose these bone-crushing, eye-watering tariffs or taxes on India after previous administrations had tried to court India because of India's contradictions with China. Now, Prime Minister Modi will not answer Mr. Trump's phone calls. Instead, he's turned up in China along with President Putin and President Xi Jinping. That is a formidable bloc indeed, speaking of China, Russia, and India. Recall that geopolitical theorists going back to the end of the 19th century have posited that Central Asia, which is a land that creeps into India, Russia, and China, is the fulcrum of planet Earth. That is to say, if you want to dominate this small planet, you should dominate Central Asia. That helped to lead to the war that the United States waged in Afghanistan, and of course the attempt to lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And of course, it led directly to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. But now the worm is turned. U.S. imperialism is well aware of this. And so therefore, once again, is trying to get ahead of the curve by crushing the potential for dissent, not least in the seat of power, speaking of Washington, D.C.
And do you see this as a move to try and, I mean, in your state of Texas, we just recently seen 5 congressional seats that were Democratic be turned over to Republicans, essentially making it to where you need 3 African Americans to make 1 white vote, or 5 individuals from Mexican or indigenous descent to make 1 white vote. Could you just speak to this potentially being a strategy move to ensure that when 2026 midterms come around, which are coming upon us, that the Republicans, especially Trump's cabinet, ensures that they keep Senate and they keep state, which was essential for the past 6 months of them rolling out, I would have to say 40%, if not 50% of Project 2025, of which 30 was already implemented before Trump was even in office. So,
well, this crude reapportionment in the Lone Star State is a harbinger of what we no doubt will see in states like Missouri, where the governor is embarking on a similar path. There's pressure on the state of Indiana to do likewise. On the flip side, you see California trying to recoup with the Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom seeking to reapportion his state in order to oust 5 Republicans and therefore balance the 5 Democrats who presumably will be ousted in 2026 as a result of this new map. Now, as a number of news reports have pointed out, the Republicans are betting heavily upon what they see as a permanent realignment of the Latino population, the Mexican American population, particularly in South Texas, which tipped in the direction of Mr. Trump in 2024, but there's a lot of discontent since 2024 about Mr. Trump's policies, particularly the attack on Medicaid, the attack on SNAP or food stamps, not to mention the rather draconian immigration policies, where the U.S. authorities have suggested that if you look a certain way, that provides probable cause for them to ask you for your papers. And of course, the cases are now legion, whereby citizens of Mexican ancestry have been detained on the grounds that they do not necessarily belong here. In fact, you may recall a few decades ago, the semi-comic film Born in East LA, which has as the plot point a Mexican American who's caught up in an immigration raid and sent across the border to Baja California. That was seen as a kind of joke some decades ago, but now it's a bitter reality. So the Republicans may be out on a limb when they suppose that they have a stranglehold on the Mexican American vote, on the Latino vote. We shall see soon enough, because Mr. Trump feels quite properly that if the House of Representatives is flipped, and of course they're only going to be a change in maybe 3 to 4 to 5 seats in order for that to happen, that he'll be up for his 3rd impeachment, for example. Not to mention the fact that there is a danger that the Senate may flip as well. So this is the state of play as we speak.
Thank you. I have a question that is from our comrade Anthony Ballas from the De facto podcast, and I quote, he states, "It is no secret that we are facing a severe crisis in education in the United States, from brood capitulation to the Trump regime's anti-DEI initiatives, lack of already threadbare federal funding, the fascist crackdown on the student movements for Palestine, the incursion of white right-wing finance into higher ed, to the dissemination of humanities programs in the public and private institutions alike, and so on and so forth. What could be done to resist these forces, and what is your analysis of this situation more generally?"
More generally, my analysis is that Mr. Trump has decided that in order to roast the pig, he's going to burn down the house. That is to say that despite the United States having world-leading institutions of higher education and world-leading scientists at these institutions of higher education, Mr. Trump feels that these institutions are a hotbed of anti-conservative sentiment. And so therefore you see the weaponizing of so-called anti-Semitism in order to deprive universities of federal funds that oftentimes go for humanitarian purposes, like finding a cure for cancer or Alzheimer's, for example. And this is the policy that he's pursuing. Now, I think if we consult our history, we'll realize that in order to compel Jim Crow to retreat in the 1960s and the 1950s, it took mass mobilization, mass organization It took sacrifice, for example, people going to prison or to jail. In order to organize unions in the 1930s, it required mass organization, mass mobilization. Oftentimes there were injuries, if not deaths. I would not necessarily wish that upon anyone, that is to say, the latter factor, but certainly it's going to require some sacrifice, I'm afraid to say. And fortunately, I think that part of this movement is in motion, particularly in the District of Columbia, where you've seen significant mobilization against the neo-fascist experiment. Campuses are opening as we speak, and I expect that students and faculty and staff will not be intimidated and will not be cowed. And I think that that bodes well for the near future.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. I want to take this conversation to the international stage. We have the International Global Samud Flotilla, which is at this point over 50 flotillas that are making way to Gaza to create what is known as a humanitarian aid corridor, as there is a siege on humanitarian aid, as we know, going on in Gaza. IPC reported that there is, at this point in time, a catastrophe, Nakba, a famine going on, and this is a part of the uh, ethnic cleansing and settler colonial, agenda that is, not just Bibi Netanyahu, but the Israeli occupation as a whole. Could you speak to the importance of showing solidarity with the global Samud that is doing international work for which that our international agencies are unwilling to do, and to hold Israel accountable for the genocide that we've seen in 4K at this point?
Well, with regard to what you just referenced, the situation is quite dire and grim. That is to say, it's not only the unleashing of famine in Gaza, it's not only the plans in motion to ethnically cleanse that part of historic Palestine, it's not only the settlers on the West Bank unleashing terrorism against the inhabitants there, something that was recently denounced by visiting Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, amongst others, for example. So it is well that these heroic flotillas are sailing towards historic Palestine, because we can do little more, or we can at least salute their heroism. But there may be worse in store, because analysts are suggesting that within the next few weeks or months, there will be a resumption of the so-called 12-day war of June 2025, the piratical Israeli attack backed by U.S. imperialism on Iran. We saw a very dangerous maneuver by the Israeli pirates just the other day, when singled out for assassination was a political leader in Yemen. That is quite ominous and quite dangerous when you begin to assassinate political leaders, because what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, for example. But when you mention flotilla, before you began to articulate the point, I had thought that we were going to discuss the U.S. naval flotilla heading towards Venezuela, including nuclear submarines, with the Venezuelans mobilizing and arming the masses. This is taking place in the context of an election in neighboring Guyana on September 1st, 2025, because part of the alleged rationale for U.S. imperialism is this territorial dispute between Venezuela and its neighbors, speaking of Guyana, with an oil-rich territory supposedly being at issue, speaking of Essequibo. And U.S. imperialism has significant investments in Guyana, despite the claim that the reason for this naval flotilla from the United States is the allegation that President Maduro is a drug lord, leading to a $50 million bounty on his head. A more sober and realistic analysts acknowledge that Mr. Trump, in the recent past, expressed a desire to place his grubby little paws on Venezuela's formidable oil reserves. And with that, in conjunction with Guyana's oil reserves, and with that, in conjunction with overthrowing of the Islamic Republic and getting control of Iranian oil reserves, that U.S. imperialism would have leverage with which to confront peers and rivals alike, not to mention the European Union, but also the People's Republic of China, which is in the process of thwarting such a diabolical plan by being a leader in green energy, by being a leader in electrification, doing an end run around the petroleum industry, although it's fair to say that for some years to come, even China will be importing petroleum. So U.S. imperialism, once again, sees that its hegemony and its domination is unraveling. And I think it's leading to ever intensified hysteria. And if we're not careful, this ever intensified hysteria will bite those of us who are resisting, not to mention those of us who are sitting on their hands, will bite us in a manner that we will not find enjoyable or pleasing.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brung up what to me sounded like the explaining how America is maneuvering simply because it knows that the U.S. dollar is crumbling internationally, domestically. I've heard on numerous occasions you state that if they gave individual status to BRICS, that you would sign up for it. I would be right along there with you. I wanted, if you could speak to, why China has such a economic, at this point, stranglehold on America, being that for years it seemed to work within the parameters of American empire to then suit the needs of its people rather than make a profit off of its people. Could you explain that? I've been reading a book by Roland Bohr called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. And a lot of the book goes over the economic structure of China and how it alleviates or at least alienates in some degree private sectors and does not make that a focal point nor an exploitive means of the people. Could you just explain to one how America has put itself in this position where others are working with each other, like China, like Iran, like BRICS essentially, and how they're utilizing this to cripple the U.S. dollar and at the same time build their economic footing, which is essentially what we're seeing happen, which is scaring U.S. economy. It's scaring international U.S. trade simply because people are unwilling to sacrifice their people simply for America to have a quote unquote fair share, as Trump has alluded to.
Well, it all goes back a half century or more to the early 1970s when the Kissinger Nixon gambit to play on the contradictions between Moscow and Beijing by seeking to woo Beijing into the anti-Soviet camp. And in return, there would be massive US and European foreign direct investment into China. That gambit has boomeranged spectacularly. Interestingly enough, as we speak, I'm doing a book on this particular topic. And the other day, I was looking at the archive of Leonard Woodcock, whose name you may recall. He was the leader of the United Auto Workers and then was appointed by President Jimmy Carter as the first U.S. ambassador to China in the late 1970s. And in that position, he shepherded the influx of U.S. capital into China, and in fact, U.S. industrial plants, leading to the deindustrialization of his own industry, for example, to the point where Jim Farley of Ford Motor has said that if that particular company and the big three in Michigan are to survive, they'll have to have technology transfers in terms of battery technology from China to the United States. Now, when this process began, there were technology transfers from the United States into China. But now the worm has turned and the technology transfers are going in the other direction. In fact, when the leader of South Korea was in the Oval Office just a few days ago, he announced that there would be technology transfers from South Korea to the United States shipbuilding industry so that it could better compete. It was not so long ago that technology transfers were going from the United States into. So that gives you an idea of how the world has changed. And China, in addition, has been busily trying to win allies, not least in Africa. You may recall when then Vice President Harris made a tour of Africa, landing in airports in Accra, Ghana, Lusaka, Zambia, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. All of these airports were either built or designed by Chinese interests. If she had explored further the process of transportation on the African continent, she could have taken a train from Nairobi to Mombasa on the Indian Ocean coast, constructed by Chinese interests, or from Ethiopia to Djibouti, constructed by Chinese interests. And this has led to a kind of competition that China has ignited, because just a few days ago as well, in Yokohama, Japan, there was a major summit with African leaders and Japanese leaders, with Japan not only pledging capital influx into Africa, but pledging to train 30,000 AI specialists, artificial intelligence specialists in Africa, for example. This is at a time when the United States is cutting back on aid to Africa, the Agency for International Development, headquartered in Washington. According to Elon Musk, the erstwhile first buddy of Mr. Trump was fed into the wood chipper, for example. Voice of America, which used to broadcast propaganda into Africa. Matter of fact, I used to listen to Voice of America broadcasts, not only when I was living in Zimbabwe, but even here in the United States for various reasons. And now it's been mothballed as well. So US imperialism is in a process of retreat, while China and increasingly Japan are advancing in 7 league boots. So this is just a reflection of the crisis of US imperialism, a crisis that inevitably will intensify in coming months and years, which then brings us back to the neo-fascist experiment in Washington, D.C., because there is a fear amongst the US ruling class that with the crisis of US imperialism, that there will be folks taken to the streets, peasants with pitchforks, as used to be said, and that presents a grave danger, as well it does, to the continued domination of Wall Street and Washington as it now exists.
Yes, I'd like to, just for the last bit of time that we do have, discuss the importance of your latest book, if in titled "The Capital of Slavery, Washington D.C., 1800 to 1865," which individuals can find on the International Publishers website, which I will have in the link, a link below, directly to the book, so you can be able to get your copy. I have not gotten my copy yet. I am using a comrade's copy right now, to be able to formulate some questions for the next sit down with Dr. Horne regarding that. But if you could go over, Dr. Horne, in brief, you know, the importance of writing the capital of slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865, and its importance now as we see, as we've been talking about Trump and his oligarchical regime continuing their conclave, essentially, of eradicating and erasing history, moments in time, and also distorting narratives. We see that he's taken over the Smithsonian and has, basically uttered that he will be, defunding portions of history, essentially, just to completely withering it away. Can you explain the importance of your book now in a time where Trump, his cabinet, is erasing history?
Well, first of all, your audience should realize that there is a schism in the historiography. Increasingly, a number of Black creators, including the late Tyler Stovall, perhaps the most garlanded historian of African ancestry in the United States of America, former president of the American Historical Association, his book, White Freedom, and that title says it all in terms of his analysis of 1776. I'm thinking of Ishmael Reed, the paramount Black intellectual, who did a spoof and a send-up of the Disney come Broadway extravaganza Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, where Ishmael seeks to reinstate and reinforce the primacy of slavery in terms of the founding of the United States of America. I'm thinking of the most celebrated filmmaker in the Pan-African world, speaking of Raoul Peck, former Minister of Culture in Haiti, and his documentary, which you can find, Exterminate All the Brutes, a sweeping castigation of settler colonialism, a term conspicuously missing from the ordinary vocabulary of many of our friends on the left. And of course, some of the sternest critics of this term and the historiography have been our friends on the left for whatever reason, despite the fact that there were thousands of enslaved Africans on the verge of the triumph of the slave owners in 1776, and millions on the verge of the U.S. Civil War in 1861, many of our friends on the left continue to insist that this was a great leap forward for humanity. They tend to mumble when you ask them about Native American dispossession and its role in the formation of the United States of America. They tend to glide past the monstrosity of Native American genocide. No wonder we're staring down the barrel of fascism, given this kind of ideological backwardness. But in any case, my book fits in that former tradition. And of course, I would be remiss if I failed to acknowledge my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which in a sense helped to kick off this trend. And this book, The Capital of Slavery, is seeking to accelerate this trend, pointing out the resistance of the enslaved with regard to the formation of this republic. I find it curious that even some of our so-called friends on the left, they have withering critiques of socialism past and present, but have no analysis of republicanism or anti-monarchy. Although it's apparent that when republicanism was established in North America, that the divine right of monarchs was replaced in the first instance by the divine right of propertied men of European descent. And then with the advent of Mr. Trump's favorite president in the 1820s, speaking of Andrew Jackson, the divine right of men of European descent more generally. Africans revolted and rebelled against this monstrosity, particularly in August 1814, when they joined invaders in torching the White House, sending President James Madison and his girlless spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets. This led to a reaction by the U.S. ruling elite. They blamed the free Negro population for this. Maryland, the adjacent neighbor to Washington, had one of the largest free Negro populations in the United States of America. And so it was decided to ship the free Negroes to West Africa, hence the creation of the state of Liberia about 200 years ago. With the Nat Turner slave revolt in neighboring Virginia in August 1831, the idea was to ship rebellious enslaved there as well. Then it was all capped off in what is now West Virginia, Harper's Ferry, when John Brown and his multiracial band did an armed assault on enslavement that was only defeated by the dispatching of the U.S. military, leading to the U.S. Civil War. Interestingly enough, during the U.S. Civil War, you had the enslaved in Washington. And by the way, at the same time that you had congresspersons on Capitol Hill prattling and prating about freedom and liberty, in the shadow of the Capitol, Africans were being sold like mules and cattle, for example. I wonder how our friends on the left explain that perversity. In any case, with the Civil War, you had slavery abolished in Washington before the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. And unlike the abolition of slavery in Haiti, where the enslavers were compensated for their losses, or the abolition of slavery in Jamaica, Barbados, the British Empire, when the enslavers were compensated for their losses. Interestingly enough, in Dixie, when slavery was abolished in 1865, the enslavers were not compensated, leading to the ferocity of white supremacy by dint of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and lynching. Interestingly, the enslavers in Washington were compensated. Let's not even get to the question of the compensation of the enslaved and their descendants, which happily will be on the agenda a few days from now in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, when you have a face-to-face meeting, the first of its kind between leaders of the African Union and Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, etc., with reparations being high on the agenda. The other aspect that I'll conclude with of this book is what we began with. That is to say, that it's no accident that Washington is in the crosshairs today. Washington, for the longest, has been the Achilles heel, the aching Achilles heel of the US empire. And that is why Mr. Trump is taking preemptive action to rein in the possibility of dissent and protest. But I dare say that this will not succeed.
Yes, well, thank you, Dr. Horn. It looks like we got less than 3 minutes left, so I just want to say thank you for your time. And I did have one last question, and it's a simple question, nothing too elaborate. Aside from your book that you advocate for people to read, which is, again, for those you can find at the International Publishers website, down below, link is in the description, titled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. What are some other books that you might have been diving into yourself that you might think the viewers would love or compliment your book, again titled "The Capital of Slavery, Washington D.C. from 1800 to 1865"?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because there's so many that when I began to try to pluck out books that stand out, it seems my brain goes into overdrive. But in any case, I'm writing an introduction, a new introduction to a book that was published years ago. I'm speaking of the book by Harry Haywood, the late Harry Haywood, Black Bolshevik, the autobiography of an Afro-American communist. And it's really a fascinating read. It's very long, but you know, he learns Russian, spends time in the Soviet Union, meeting with Stalin, getting involved in political disputes there, and then crosses back across the Atlantic to Harlem, for example. So that's a book that sticks out in my mind. And there are so many others that I wouldn't even go down that path.
Hey, I just have to say, Dr. Horn, that is a flex. If I didn't know one to have read and all of these books, and find it really hard to jot down one. But Black Bolshevik is a really good one. I've read Black Bolshevik by Harry Haywood, and I'm really curious to know what your new work is. But I'll wait until everybody else finds out what that might be. Thank you, Dr. Horn, again for your time and energy, and apologies for the beginning half, butchering my my introduction and my opening monologue, my iPad decided to go black on me, so I had a black screen, and so I could not see my monologue. So I had to go base off of what I remembered writing down. So thank you for sticking through that, and I look forward to having you back on to go over again. For those that weren't aware, his new book is titled "The Capital of Slavery, Washington D.C., 1800 to 1865," and you guys can get that at the International Publishers website, which is the link is in the description. And I will have you on for that again. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Horn, for your time and energy.
Thank you for inviting me, and be sure to send the link
I will, no problem. Alrighty.
so I can sign
So
off, right?
yeah, you can go ahead and go. I'm gonna be talking for a little bit by myself, so
Okay,
you
good
can go
luck
ahead
to
and go.
you.
Thank you. All right, you guys, that was Dr. Gerald Horne. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that tuned in. And I just wanted to cue in some personal stuff here. Dr. Horne doesn't need to be here for that. Being the Patreon. If you liked what you heard, aside from the beginning of this conversation, as I butchered the opening monologue and the first question, but we are all good. We had a really good conversation. If you liked what you heard, please support us at patreon.com/tin media. That is the best way to help us out. Monthly subscriptions help us out immensely. And if you are an individual that is like, hey, I can only do like a one-time thing, we got some cash links that are available there. And if you're in the same position that I am, where I'm only able to afford what afford to pay for this, afford to give you guys the educational content, it's all good. Like, share, subscribe, and later on down the line, if you have it, we're grateful and we're thankful for it. But yeah, with that being said, I just want to say again, thank you to Dr. Gerald Horne for tuning in, and thank you to everybody that came by and tuned in as well, gave their energy, listening, learning. It was a really good conversation, I felt, for me. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. We will see you guys in the next one. Um, yeah, until then, I don't really have anything else to say. I forgot to put an end to this. I will see you guys in the next one.